So now we go to the section on the external world. And so the first chapter are the three themes of Kalachakra Tantra. And here it lists those in terms of outer, inner, and other. The first one, ascertaining the number of themes. Secondly, the order of themes. And thirdly, the characteristics of each. So we begin with ascertaining the number of themes. And moving to page 76, and about the middle of the page, it talks about the outer, inner, and other. So we have realms that are the basis for practice, the form of the external world, and then the inner are the basis for practice, the form of the individual person, and the other are various ancillary topics and conferring of initiations, generation and completion, and the final goal. And then it notes that the conferring of initiations is mainly in the initiation chapter. The methods of accomplishment chapter focuses on generation stage, as well as a little bit of the completion stage. And the gnosis chapter mainly looks at the completion stage and the final fruits of practice. So it's just giving a little bit of an outline of where we are going here. In terms of the order of themes, that's divided into two parts. And so the first part talks about the natural order, and the second part, an order arising from the mode of practice. In the natural order, it talks on the top of page 77 about the destruction of the previous world brought about by subtle particles known as empty particles, which exist as isolated fragments. So if you could think about the beginning of the world, this actually fits fairly well with the scientific view that all you have are minor little elements out there. In fact, at the very beginning you just have hydrogen and then some other subparticles of atoms that haven't actually formed into atomic structures of any kind. And so they're a little bit like the empty particles that it mentions here. And they exist as fragments. And then it says their coming together creates the physical world from the air mandala up to Meru. And of course this is a symbolic form of the world, but it has a connection with what happens in the creation of a new universe and what scientists expect happened at the beginning in the creation of our universe. Then it goes on to this order arising from the mode of practice at the bottom of the page, where it mentions a quote that it's referred to previously as without, so within, which is used to try and make that connection between the outer world and the inner world. But other than that, it really doesn't, this section really doesn't say too much about that. So in the middle of page 78, we have the characteristics of each, which are only at this point listed. And so we have the first, we have these three. We have the presentation of the external world, explanation of the inner, the world of sentient beings, and the presentation of other, initiations, generation stage, completion stage, and fruits, which is basically the practice part. And so then it has a presentation of the external world, so the subcategories of that part, formation of the external world and its dimensions, which are covered in chapter 4 that we'll look at today. A general presentation of the inhabitants of this world, which is in chapter 5, and we will also look at that today. Then the Gola circling Mount Meru above the earth in chapter 6, resolving any contradictions between the presentation of the world in Kalachakra and that of the Abhidharma texts in chapter 7, although there's a little bit of that in the two chapters that we're going to look at today. So in chapter 4, then, the formation of the external world and its dimensions, it begins by saying, when a world undergoes destruction, there follows a time of emptiness. And so in Buddhism, we talk about the creation of a universe and then the existence for a period of time and then the destruction of the universe. And then other universes come and go. There never was a beginning to time unless you consider, as we often do, the time within the existence of this universe. That's kind of our model of time. But from a Buddhist perspective, we talk about beginningless time. These other universes come and go, always have, never was a beginning. And so then it goes on to say, during this time, the earth element is formed, the water element, fire element, air element, and space element. And the subtle particles of these 5 elements exist as isolated fragments. So they haven't really formed together into specific things other than these subtle particles. They are known as empty particles in isolated empty space. When the potential of the collective karma of sentient beings is ripened. Now, just to note, the Dalai Lama has said there's no such thing as collective karma, so there's a little dispute here, disagreement about the nature of karma at that level. The collective karma of sentient beings is ripened. The subtle air particles come together to form air whose nature is light and moving. So here the term element is a little bit different than what we would talk about an element from a Western scientific point of view. Okay? It has specific characteristics of light and moving. And then we can come to know the extremely subtle and hidden airs. There are subtle fire particles, subtle water particles, earth particles, the space element. These 4 elements gradually expand to form the 4 foundation mandalas. So now these things are beginning to come together and form some form of existence. And so those are these collective elements of air, fire, water, and earth. And they're, viewed as being stacked. The way that they're stacked is a little bit different here than in other tantras. Here it's in this commentary is described as the air surmounted by fire, water, and then earth. And it says they're stacked akin to the smaller measuring cups successively stacked into the larger ones. So you can imagine the larger ones and the smaller ones going inside. Each of those is just the way you would a set of measuring cups in your kitchen. Usually these are stacked in a different way. In most tantras they are literally stacked one on top of the other, so it has a little bit different presentation. The text then goes on to talking about the sizes of these in great detail. In the 3rd paragraph on page 80 it says, after the 4 mandalas have formed, winds that support, churn up, and shape bring about the formation of Meru, the other mountains and continents. And then it goes into some detailed explanation about the sizes related to each of these. And then the next paragraph surrounding Meru is a circular area extending outward. Beyond this is an area stretching out to the edge of the Shita Mountains. And then it talks about this all being divided into 18 regions, and 6 continents, 6 seas, and 6 mountain ranges. More traditionally, we talk about 4. So usually the Mount Meru is then surrounded by 4 continents and then the seas and so forth. So the numbers vary from the more common presentation of this. And it goes through and it gives names for each of these in terms of the continents, the seas, and the mountain ranges. And then it talks a little bit about them in terms of sizes and how they are described that way. And then it says that the mountains, continents, seas, and so forth are in the form of discs surrounding Meru. So if you imagine the formation of these elements, and they were described as being like cups, measuring cups inside of each other, and those form sort of like discs, if you will, if you were looking at the top of them all already setting inside of each other. And then we have these other discs, and it goes through and describes the sizes of each of these discs. And then in the last paragraph then on 81 it says this just to elaborate a little bit on this, not that the details in my opinion are important, but just to give you a sense of the complexity of what it's talking about here. In the lower half of the air mandala are the Vajra flames hell and the crying hell. In the upper half lies the great darkness hell. The lower half of the fire mandala is found the fire hell. The upper half is the endless smoke hell. Now these names are a little bit different than what we've probably traditionally seen in terms of various hell realms and so forth. So these are the hot hells. Then within the water mandala, the lower half contains the swamps hell. The upper half makes the sandy water hell. So again, using slightly different names than are used more traditionally, particularly with respect to the Abhisheka. And these are the cold hells. Then the lower half of the earth mandala contains the gravel water hell, and the upper is the home of the Asuras and the Nagas. Then at the top of 82, we go on here. We have 12 sectors that can be home for any of the realms of humans, animals, and ghosts. So it's a little bit vague about how those are actually developed, how they fit together, and how they're described, and so forth. This Tantra, so we're talking about Kalachakra here, and its commentaries do not speak of any special abodes for animals and ghosts. Greater Jambadvipa, which is the human realm normally, here it says the greater Jambadvipa on the earth mandala is known as the realm of karma, while the 6 inner continents are known as the realms of enjoyment. I'm not quite sure where that term enjoyment comes from in terms of the other realms. It doesn't quite make a lot of sense in some of those contexts. Sometimes the God realms are described with that as a descriptor, but I haven't seen it in any other place, so I can't articulate exactly what that is intending here. In about the middle of the page, a little below the quotation there in the middle of the page, east, south, north, and west are respectively the realms of air, fire, water, and earth. So instead of in a normal presentation where they would be stacked on top of each other, they are here articulated in terms of the 4 cardinal directions around the outside edges of that, if you will. And then again it goes into descriptions, detailed descriptions of various sizes and shapes of all of these. And then the last paragraph at the bottom says, concerning the gods of the desire realm, the great commentary says that, O Meru, the gatherings of Indra, Brahma, and so forth. And so then it talks about the abodes of some of the gods of the desire realm, but it says these are not taught definitely. So again, some of these things are a little bit vague here. However, Indra, king of the gods, and his retinue must live on Meru, and gods in their entirety must be posited throughout Meru and the lower third of the throat of Meru. Throat of Meru. So in here we get some descriptors that are given almost as if Meru is not a mountain but a being of some kind. Now that would make a connection if you think about Kalachakra in general, where it's trying to make a connection between the outer or external world and the internal world, okay, in the form of the body. And so you can get these connections. And again, it goes through, it gives names, sizes of these different things, colors and shapes and so forth. Then I wanted to point out in the middle of the page, again just below the quote there on page 83, the shape of Meru is circular. And that's unique as well, because Meru is usually described as being a 4-sided pyramid, a little bit like the pyramids in Egypt. Okay? So they have flat sides, each a different color, in the 4 directions. But here it says that it is circular, and in addition to that, if that wasn't enough, it has 5 horns, okay, that are slender at the base with large tips. And there are many differing assertions about these horns. So again, we don't have any definitive description of what these are, but it then goes through some detailed descriptions about these. And then it talks a little bit about the size of Meru. And on page 84, again, that gives additional descriptions related to that. There's a paragraph on the throat of Meru, and going through detail about that. There's a paragraph on the base of the crown to its tip and how it's divided up. There's a paragraph at the bottom of the page about the formless realms. And then over on page 85, it begins to make a connection or differentiation, which is given in much more detail later on, about the differences between the Kalachakra and the Abhidharma. And in the second paragraph on 85, it makes that comparison specifically with the Abhidhammakosha text. At the bottom, it also says that there are also other alternative explanations of these things. So again, we're left with a rather vague understanding of what some of that might be. But going to page 86, at the top of the page in the first paragraph, the position of highest Tantra is that beings of the formless realms do have form. So now he's beginning to talk about this issue of form versus formless. And because according to the Tantras and commentaries of Guhya Samaja and others, every sentient being possesses the very subtle mind and the very subtle wind. Moreover, this subtle wind is explained as being of 5 colored light rays. Therefore, not only do beings of the formless realms possess the aggregate of form, they also possess source forms such as blue, yellow, and so forth. So now, see, even though that it's in the form realm, they have these very subtle aspects that normally would be considered form. We have form within the formless, if you will. Moreover, in the Kalachakra Tantra and its commentaries, it is explained that these beings also possess subtle particles of the 5 elements. So even Kalachakra talks about characteristics that are normally considered related to a form, even though they're described as being in the formless realm. And then just below the quotation there, the formless beings possess sound alone as their primary quality and are of the nature of the space element. And so the space element, of course, would not have any qualities or characteristics, and the only thing described about them is sound itself, which we think of as a vibration, if you will. So a different way of describing it, and it makes it difficult to make connections between the way that we understand it and the way that it is being described here in the Kalachakra. But then it goes on and gives a little bit more explanation, and in the last paragraph it says that earth, water, fire, and air, together with their qualities of form and so forth, are present in the fluid drop of formless beings as qualities in general form only. So we can infer from that that it's not very specific, it's just they've made a connection there in a general way. And these are then understood as being in a minuscule form. They're so very tiny we can't actually perceive them, and so from our perception it would then be formless. Also in tantras such as Guhya Samaja, the indestructible red and white elements of the very subtle mind and wind exist together as a single unit. And we often talk about the indestructible drop as residing at the heart. Indestructible, so it can't be destroyed in any way. And this is said to be present in the mind streams of all beings without a moment interruption since beginningless time. And it's associated then with our innate Buddha nature. So then he says, indestructible means nothing can destroy it. Therefore, although beings of formless realms are said to be without form by the sutra tradition, it is the position of this tantra, the great commentary, as well as other highest tantras, that they do possess form. Then going down below the next quotation here, we're on page 87. Below the lower limit of the air mandala and above the upper limit of the crown, so here subdividing these into various parts, the subtle particles of the 5 elements of earth and so forth exist as individual and disconnected particles, undetectable to the senses of ordinary beings. So this is what I was just referring to. So we can't perceive them in any way. Just like we can't perceive atoms from a Western point of view unless we have an electron microscope or something. And we can't perceive other very, very tiny, not only particles, but in fact certain beings. Some single cell animals are too small for us to visually see without some kind of magnification. So this is known as mere emptiness, as appears as empty space. But beyond this lies the empty space of the disconnected particles of the 5 elements, known as total emptiness. So we have mere emptiness where these particles abide in some way, and then we have total emptiness where they have been refined down to their smallest, finest nature, in which no one can actually find anything at all. Then moving on to page 88, to the last paragraph, well, next to last, right below the last quotation mark there. And here is talking about how these things can be stacked together to form different measures of distance. Okay, so we have a string of 8 subtle particles is the width of a tip, a hair at its tip. So pretty tiny. 1 black mustard seed, and 8 mustard seeds would be 1 louse. 8 of those would be 1 barley grain. 8 of those, 1 finger width. 24 of those, 1 cubit. And a cubit is normally the distance from our elbow up to the tips of our fingers. And then 4 cubits are an arm span. That would be in both directions. And then 2,000 arm spans are 1 crochet, and 4 crochet make 1 yojana, which is a term that they've been using throughout here when they talk about distances and sizes and so forth. And so I looked that term up. It was a little hard to find, but I found it. And there's actually a note at the end here that says somewhere around 9 miles versus the Abhidharma, which says it's about 5 miles. But I found it in another place. It said it's about 8 miles is the common representation. But there are references anywhere from 4 to 10 miles. So take your pick. Give you some idea of the kind of distances that they're talking about here, at least. And then the original formation of this was based on the distance that a team of oxen that are yoked together could travel in one day. So that's the origin of the term. But again, I can imagine that some of the differences in terms of this could be that different oxen are able to travel at different distances during the day. And it may even depend upon the time of year as to how long the day is that you're using as your measure and so forth. So there are all kinds of possibilities associated with this. Continuing on page 89, below the next quote there at the top of the page, the reasons for this information are, firstly, to bring about correspondence between the inner world of the practitioner's body and the outer world. So again, trying to re-emphasize that connection between the outer world and the inner or body, which form the 2 bases for purification in the deity mandala meditation. And secondly, to bring about correspondence between these 2 bases of purification and the mandala itself, which is the actual purifier. So it then starts making many correlations, again, in terms of dimensions of these various factors as we go through all of this. I won't go through all of that detail, but that is the way in which this chapter is concluded. So that is an overview of the external world as depicted by the Kalachakra.